wanted to let you know I don't have any financial disclosures. Mark Twain, one of my very favorites. Age is an issue of mind over matter. It doesn't mind. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter. And I think for those of us who are able to age fairly well, I think that's where many of us are. I think other people have health problems, and that kind of really affects how they look at aging. I also think we have a lot of sort of societal issues around how we look at aging. I'm going to just review some of the shifting demographics. I'm going to touch on normal cognitive aging, what gets better as we age, what stays the same, and what takes more time or is more challenging. I'm hearing an echo. Are you guys hearing an echo? Okay. And then I'm going to talk about myths and misconceptions, and then finally, hopefully give you some useful tips and some references for seeing even more useful things. So this is an image I captured offline, and if you look at this, I think the first three people in both the top and bottom rows are between the ages of 0 and 18, say. And we have all sorts of words to describe that group of people. So they are neonates, infants, toddlers, young children, middle-aged children, adolescents, young adults, all those stages for those 18 years. Now, the last two people in this row, in these two rows, I would say the second to last one might be somebody in their, say, 50s or early 60s. But the last person really is set to represent everybody who is, say, 65 to 110. So for the first 18 years, we have, 6, 7, 8 stages. And then we take everybody who's 65 and older and we say, oh, well, they're just old. So I just think I think we really need to start looking at older adults and the multiple phases that older adults have. And I think as the baby boomers come of age, they started turning 65 a couple years ago and will continue for the next 9 years or so. And what we're experiencing is the most diverse older generation ever seen in this country. 13% of the population, and this was actually back as of 2012, was 65 or older. And that is just going to get bigger, probably much, much bigger. In 2050, over 80 million people will be over 65 in this country. So we really, it would behoove us to figure out how to do well at communicating. And when I think about communicating, one of the first things I think about is brain function. And so cognitive skills sort of come in two different sets. So there's the crystallized skills, which are sort of static, and then there's fluid skills. So static, crystallized skills, overlearned knowledge. So like if you're a carpenter, using a hammer, using a screwdriver, using tools that you use every day in whatever type of work you do or hobbies you have. Vocabulary and general knowledge. Generally you learn history and it more or less stays with you. So crystallized knowledge and skills are stable or they improve with aging. Fluid skills, on the other hand, which turn out to be pretty important: problem solving, reasoning, executive functioning. the speed of our thoughts, our memory, our psychomotor abilities, our hand-eye coordination, all that. Well, I hate to break it to all of us, but those all peak in our third decade of life. So, then all of those skills are in very gradual decline for the rest of our lives, which for most people is significantly more than half your life. So now don't hold the train there. Don't get despair. What do we know? Well, with memory, long-term knowledge remains the same. Recent memory and formation of memories is vulnerable in aging. So not everybody develops memory problems as we get older, but it takes us more brain energy to remember things, to store things, to make new memories, to form them, and to retrieve them. And so it's more effort and more time practicing to learn something as we get older. Attention, so simple attention, such as being able to do one thing at a time, like watch a TV show, is fairly preserved in the vast majority of people. However, divided attention, what I think that when I was a teenager, we called it multitasking. That was the big thing. Oh, we're all just multitaskers. Well, it turns out nobody really multitasks all that well, but we can move our attention back and forth pretty quickly and follow multiple trains of thought. And that becomes more and more difficult as we get older. So why would that matter? So for instance, you're talking to an older adult, a patient on the phone or in their hospital room or in the room in their facility. If they have their TV on or their radio on, it is going to be extremely difficult for them to only pay attention to you. So if you're calling your parent from far away and they're watching their favorite TV show, you either have to call back later or they have to turn their TV off. If you really want them to attend and pay attention to what you're talking about, if you want them to recall later any of the details. So divided attention becomes more and more difficult the older we get. And again, that really does start 30s, 40s. Language, so vocabulary is preserved. And in fact, this is the one thing where older adults far outshine us. The older you are, the more likely you are to have a significantly larger vocabulary. So Scrabble is a great game for older adults if they don't have, significant brain disease, because their vocabulary just gets better and better. Of course, for Scrabble, you also need spelling. But anyway, okay, so word retrieval, however, does take longer when we get older. So it's not that you lose the words, but it does take, so sometimes you have to search for the right word, but the information is there in your brain. There are certain diseases where that's true too. So for instance, Parkinson's disease, this is a key thing in Parkinson's disease. It can look like somebody with Parkinson's has pretty significant memory impairment, but what it is usually is that it takes them far, far longer than average to recall information. And sometimes they need cues or hints to recall it. So that's one of the reasons why things like lists and multiple choice things can be more helpful the older we get. So I want to drill down a little bit on reasoning and problem solving. And this is just normal aging. So if the way you solve a problem that you've seen many, many times, let's just use an artificial example, like a maze, right? If you learn a maze and you're in the same maze, you don't have any problems sort of solving that. If you do Sudoku and you've been doing it for a long time, you can still do that. Your traditional way of solving those kinds of problems is preserved. But what happens when we get older is that if you encounter a new kind of problem, it takes a lot longer for an older person to work it out than it does for a younger person. So this is really important for, say, occupational therapy and physical therapy to know. This is important for nurses when they're doing teaching of older adults, or physicians and nurse practitioners and PAs when we're working with older adults. It takes a lot longer for them to problem solve. It takes a lot longer for them to learn things. And you really just need to review things and practice more than you do with people who are, say, in their 30s. And then finally, how fast your brain is actually processing information declines with normal aging. And then, of course, there's all sorts of other things that affect how your cognition is going. So there's all the medications that you take that can impact your brain in lots of different ways. Your senses. So if you're not hearing, hearing loss is the number one false positive kind of thing for somebody with dementia. If somebody has significant hearing loss, they can look like they have advanced dementia, but it's really that they can't hear. So when somebody is starting to have cognitive impairment, one of the things you really want to focus on is, can they hear? And fix that if it's possible to fix it. And then vision loss. Again, that is relatively common. There's sort of the classic becoming farsighted and needing reading glasses, as well as other vision problems that increase with age, glaucoma and cataracts and such. Other things that can affect it are anything that affects your blood flow, the oxygen in your blood, or the glucose level in your blood. Those are all things that your brain needs. So heart failure, kidney failure, respiratory diseases like COPD and diabetes. Those are the kind of things that really significantly impact your cognitive aging. And pain is a general stressor. And when we're in pain, it's sort of, your brain is getting constant signals from whatever is sending the pain signals to your brain. And then it becomes kind of a matter of divided attention. So if somebody is in a lot of pain, they're always having to override the pain to pay attention to something else. So pain makes everything harder as far as thinking, problem solving, learning, memory. And then finally, changes in mood or anxiety can affect motivation and attention and other cognitive factors. I do want to point out, and this is really important, both for our own aging and for those around us. It turns out that people who have a positive image of aging will have a significant different life expectancy. So there's kind of what I think of as maybe the Native American Inuit type of, or even maybe Asian image of aging, the wise elder who, Buddha kind of thing, self-realization, satisfied, vital, robust. So there's this positive image of aging, which sometimes you get when we see like a little blurb on the TV about somebody who lived to be 100 or 105. At the same time, we have vastly more media images that are very negative of people who are old: useless, helpless, devalued, abused, neglected. That's actually, I think, at least in my, what I've seen in the media, is much, much more common. So it turns out that what you believe is really important, and it's much more important than when you're male, than whether you're male or female, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're lonely, and just sort of seeing it in a picture. This was, they interviewed people and they sort of put them in two groups. Is this a group of people who sees the positive side of aging, or is this a group of people who sees the negative side of aging? And what people believed really impacted how long they lived, which I think is just very fascinating. I'm going to go over some of the common myths. Older adults aren't interested in the outside world. Well, it turns out they are much more likely to use the internet than they used to be. They're far more likely to have the resources and time to do international travel. And of course, many older adults continue to work. Number two, older adults don't need or want close relationships. They're, sort of the image of the gruff old guy who just leave me alone. Well, it turns out if that gruff old guy who says just leave me alone probably was a gruff young guy who said leave me alone. That's a pretty static thing for people. Older people contribute little to society. They just sort of suck off resources. You can sort of see that image sometimes. Well, older adults are actually quite valuable with the amount of knowledge they have, at least in my organization. They're often some of the best employees, and most volunteers are older. A lot of mentors are older. So they do actually, in fact, contribute. As you age, you get more set in your ways. Could not be farther from the truth. Older adults actually have more mental resilience than younger adults. Now, that's not to say people who are sick, right? So people who are ill may lose some of that mental resilience, right? But this is older adults in general. And then, of course, deterioration is inevitable in age. Well, certainly age, we all age, you either die or you age. Those are sort of the two choices there, and they're kind of mutually exclusive. But we can prevent or slow down some of the aging and mental processes. Older people are impoverished. Well, there's certainly some truth to that, and that was certainly very true before Medicare and Medicaid in the 1960s. Which have done a lot in our country to impact poverty levels. Again, between 1999 and 2009, overall for older adults, incomes rose and poverty rates fell. However, there are some groups of people that are notably different: Hispanic women, Black women. I think that I haven't seen specific data on Native Americans, but that's probably, they're probably disenfranchised in a similar manner. Older people are not interested in sex or intimacy. Well, turns out the fastest growing place for STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, is the assisted living facility. Which means as a healthcare provider, you actually need to think about that and educate about safe sex with your older adults. And I think that is a totally different way of thinking about things than most of us healthcare providers look at it. The view that older people can't make good decisions. Well, one of the best things that helps you make good decisions is experience. And of course, who has more experience than an older person? Older adults lose their desire to live. Well people want to live, and they want to live well. And a lot of times sick people may lose their desire to live, or they lose their desire to live as they are right now, but I think, again, this has more to do with being well or not well rather than the actual age. And then, of course, I'm not sure that this really is a myth, but maybe there are people out there who think that science has answered all our questions about aging. I'm not sure science has answered all our questions about anything, but it certainly has not about aging. So this is a cartoon, can we role play a couple who are too tired to have sex? And what is interesting to me is I saw this cartoon a number of years ago, and my immediate thought was, well, this is an old couple. So that was my ageism, and that goes right along with that myth, like older adults aren't interested in sex. And I just think there's actually zero reason to believe that that's true. And specifically on the topic of sexuality and aging, long-term care ombudsmen are kind of, I see, I spelled that wrong, are focused on this everywhere. This is some specific stuff from Iowa. That's what the IA is. Older adults, they have a right to have privacy, confidentiality, respect, to express their sexuality. And just because you live in a nursing facility or you have dementia or you live in a memory care unit doesn't mean you are incapacitated and cannot consent to sexual activity. You actually have to assess each person individually, and it can be very complicated. So when all else fails, ask. This is sort of one of my, if you ever spent any time with me, you would know I sort of have some of these stock phrases. And I usually use the version of when all else fails, ask the patient, because sometimes I find we get into these long, involved discussions between various healthcare providers, and nobody really knows what it is the patient actually wanted. And sometimes you can see that we have more information about families and what they want than what actually the patient wanted or the person. So here is some information that I found fascinating from the National Council on Aging. Older adults versus the professionals. So what are the top physical and financial health worries for older adults? Well, older adults want to maintain physical health. They're worried about memory loss, and they want to maintain mental health. Well, you can see a trend there. What are the professionals worried about? Financial scams, access to affordable housing, and memory loss. So there's a little overlap, but it's really, it just shows that the priorities are quite different. Are minorities prepared to age? Well, 42% are the minority. The minority are very prepared to age. So 42% of older adults think they're very prepared, but only 10% of professionals think older adults are very prepared. So they're both less than 50, but there's a huge difference there. Who wants to stay at home? Well, 58% of older adults have not changed residences in more than 20 years. 75% of them want to live in and intend to live in their current home for the rest of their lives, which is not always possible. And 62% of older adults would like to have more help with home modifications and repairs. And you're seeing some of that, at least in some metro areas around the country. You are seeing some more attention to that and some focus on helping people maintain their houses, because that does get more difficult when you're older if you're used to doing your own work. What about saving and budgeting? So older adults take advantage of senior discounts and they spend less. Professionals recommend working beyond retirement age and reducing housing costs, which involves moving, which has all sorts of other hidden costs, right? So if you move, you have the emotional cost of trying to make new relationships and new friends and get new activities, and often involves changes in healthcare professionals and all sorts of things. So, but it's just a totally different attitude between older adults and professionals. And finally, communities can do more. Older adults think that is an extremely important thing. 47% think communities can do more to help older adults prepare, to help the community prepare for an aging population, whereas only 37% of professionals was that on their radar. Exercise and eat healthy to stay sharp. So actually, this is one thing everybody agrees on. Exercising and healthy eating are extremely important, but older adults will tell you the number one important thing is keeping a positive attitude. So, which is sort of an internal locus of control, right? That's something that you yourself can control. You can work on your attitude. You can change your attitude. Whereas professionals were more about being active socially, which is sort of an external locus of control. All right, shifting topics here. And I do want to just say, I don't have the screen set up for me to see any questions that people may or may not have been typing in, but please type in questions. And I did make sure today to leave plenty of room for questions. Though I will warn you, if you have no questions, I will continue to talk. So this is free online if you do a download. The Gerontological Society of America, they have this publication, Communicating with Older Adults. And this has really evidence-based reviews of how to communicate. And these tips I have very much incorporated into my practice, and they really change significantly people's ability to understand and retain information from you. So, number one, recognize our tendency to stereotype people. Conduct your own assessment of yourself. Know what your common stereotypes are so that you are more likely to be able to compensate for them. And that's kind of really true about anything. So for instance, an unrelated topic, but if you have stereotypes about people with mental illness, you really need to know what your stereotypes are, because they will cloud how you look at things. But the same thing is true about older adults. Avoid speech that might be seen as patronizing or elder speak. I think that has really decreased, at least I have seen far less of that, sort of talking to older adults as if they're children. Sometimes you still see that with people with dementia, but less so, it seems to me. Monitor and control your nonverbal behavior. It's quite important to make eye contact, and it's really helpful to be at the same height, to have your head at the same height as somebody else's head. So if somebody's in a wheelchair or they're laying in a bed, or a hospital bed, for instance, or in an assisted living bed, if you really want to communicate with them, you actually need to kind of sit down. You have to be at the same height as they are, rather than towering over them, because it gives a very different message. You want to minimize background noise. Again, that's that whole divided attention thing, and older adults have lots more problems with that. And this is especially true, actually, if people have hearing aids. So our ears and our brain naturally tunes out some of the background noise, even in people who have some hearing impairment. But when you have a hearing aid, it just amplifies all noise. So it isn't the same. A hearing aid is not going to ever be quite the same as your own brain and hearing apparatus working. So minimizing background noise is very important. The more important the topic is, the more important you want to make sure you attend to that. You want to face older adults when you speak, and you want your lips at the same level as theirs. And that's for that kind of lip reading that we all do a little bit of without even thinking about it. You want to pay attention to your sentence structure when you're conveying really critical information. And so here's just a kind of a medical example. You, Mrs. Jones, have arthritis of the hip, which is making it painful for you to walk and may eventually require hip replacement surgery if we can't control your pain with medications. Well, that is a lot of information for somebody who's actually in pain sitting in front of you to capture. So a different version of that would be, Mrs. Jones, you have arthritis of the hip. The arthritis is causing pain when you walk. Taking medication should help to control your pain. If the pain continues, we might need to consider hip replacement surgery. So that's better. It does it chunks it up a little bit more. But if you really need to make it very simple, you have arthritis, that's in your hip, that arthritis is in your hip, and that arthritis is causing pain when you walk. And that's like the important thing, right? So you're telling the person what is causing the pain when they walk. And then you can pause, make sure that they understand that. And then when they're ready, you can move on to talk about medications or surgery or other things, right? So it's really taking it one thing at a time, chunking it up more, and starting with the most important part of it. Sort of some general suggestions for communication that are true for older adults, just like they're true for all of us. If you really want to know, you need to ask open-ended questions and genuinely listen. So this, frankly, isn't only for older adults, but it's still true for older adults. If you really want to know what people are thinking, you want to avoid yes/no questions. And you want to listen to both the content of the message as well as how it is expressed. You want to watch people's body language. And if you have, say, a family member and an older adult in the same room, you want to watch the body language of the older adult while their daughter or spouse is speaking, because sometimes that speaks volumes about whether they agree or disagree. And you know, one of the hardest things to do, where our brains are really, really programmed to listen to words. And so one of the really hardest things to do is to give more weight to people's behavior and emotional state than to the actual words that they're using. And I think generally speaking, you almost always want to pay more attention to what people do. You know, they say they want a certain surgery, but they have to quit smoking for 2 weeks to have this surgery. Well, if they can't quit smoking for 2 weeks to have the surgery and they don't, then do they really, really want the surgery? A simpler example, since quitting smoking is very, very challenging, would be somebody who wants to have weight loss surgery, and they have to be able to lose 10 pounds before they can do that. And they have to change their whole diet and their level of activity to do that. But if they don't do that, then the question is, do they really, you know, are they really motivated? So they say they want the surgery, but are they really motivated enough to make it work? So believing behavior over words is often the way to go, and it takes a lot of practice to do that. Specifically with older adults, one of the things to remember about is older adults often will have fear and uncertainty, both about getting older as well as disease states. So it's very important to take things slowly and make sure you're addressing any anxiety or fears that people have, and to be compassionate. As the saying goes, getting older isn't for the faint of heart. It does present more challenges or different challenges than at other ages. And some older adults have far fewer social supports, and some older adults have far fewer financial supports. So there are some reasons why the whole process when we're older can be more challenging. Make sure you include the older adult in the conversation, even if you're talking to the companion or family member or significant other or support person in the room. And so one of the things where I've done this a lot is when I'm doing cognitive testing. You know, so sometimes I'm doing a cognitive test and the family member will jump in and try and answer and compensate for the person. And so I always smile really broadly and say, and I always say it to the older person, I said, you know, I really, this part of the test is for you, but I want you to know I am going to give your daughter, your spouse, a test as soon as I'm done talking to you. So they're going to get their test. And so that the message really is for the spouse to, you know, let the person do the answering. But it is amazing how older adults who are getting tested, they always like to hear that, you know, their family is going to get a test too. And of course, I follow through with that because I ask the person with them a whole bunch of questions after I'm done with my cognitive testing with the person in front of me. So, you know, you always want to follow through, but make sure that the conversation really sort of nothing about me without me. is a phrase from the disability community, and I think that really is important with older adults. Just like with everybody else, it's very important to know about a person's cultural beliefs and their personal value system pertaining to illness and death. And that can be really different. And sometimes it's different generationally. So you may have someone whose parents, the older adult is an immigrant or is a first generation person. And so their child who is now an adult is a second generation, first or second generation. And so they may be much more acculturated and sort of have a whole different set of values and beliefs pertaining to illness and death. And so you really need to sort through whose value system are we talking about here, and just make sure to clarify that. And engaging in shared decision making, really getting what's important to people. And so one example of this would be, pain, right? So you've got somebody who's got pain. Are you going to ask them, so rate your pain on a 0 to 10 scale. And if somebody has reasons to have chronic pain, what we know as healthcare providers is we are unlikely to make that pain go away. So what I always follow that up with after I get sort of a sense of where somebody is with their pain, then I say, what is this pain stopping you from doing? So what's the functional impact of this pain on your life? And then I say, so what is it that that is important to you? And so for some people, it is much more important to them to be able to function better, whereas other people just want to be out of pain. And they are less interested in how well they function. So that's a very specific, different set of priorities, and they have different risks and benefits. So if somebody wants to function better, so then the risk there is you're going to have more pain, but I can help you, hopefully so that you're able to do a little bit more than you can do today. Whereas if somebody's goal is to be in less pain no matter what, well, I can probably help you be in less pain, at least somewhat, but that is going to impact your ability to think clearly and your ability to be sharp and pay attention mentally. And so that's the downside of treating your pain more aggressively. And so, you discuss the risk, benefits, and alternatives with the person and find out what's important to them as you make your decision. Don't assume, there are some exceptions, like the person who's 105 and still smoking. Well, it's really hard to argue that smoking is really bad for them if they're doing okay. But for all the rest of us, right, for the other 99% of people, smoking there's very little good that it's going to do for you. So just because somebody's older, don't give up. And really with the exercise, for instance, I get really specific, for some older adults who are very limited. I will say, it's really important. I want you to stand up. I want you to set a timer for 30 minutes or 60 minutes. And every time the timer goes off, I want you to stand up, and walk around the room and then come back and sit down. Now, somebody who's more fit, you might say, I want you to get up and I want you to, go walk 100 feet and back, or go walk around the block and back. You got to tailor it. And then again, just don't forget about STDs with the older adults. That is just, I'm not even sure geriatricians get much training on that. I think pediatricians get a lot more training on that, and we could probably learn from them. So providing information is important, but how you give information is even more important than what you provide. And so this is sort of a distillation of things that I said earlier. You want to present information choices one at a time. You want to use frequent brief summaries. And then at the end, you want to summarize again so that everybody, we're all on the same page here. And I myself always like to write things down for people. So I try and write things. Now that prescriptions are so much electronic, I still have some old prescription pads around, and I actually use those to write things down, like exercise things or medication things or behavioral changes. I write down the plan that we agreed on. So there are some specific things that we can do as far as like directions, and you want to be as direct and concrete and actionable as possible. So swallow 2 tablets in the morning and 2 tablets in the evening is much better than take 2 pills twice a day. And then saying, take 2 pills every 4 hours or twice a day. It's actually better to say take 1 pill in the morning and 1 pill in the evening, or 1 pill in the morning and 1 pill with dinner, or 1 pill with breakfast and 1 pill with dinner. You want to be as specific as possible rather than generic. And actually telling people to swallow 2 tablets or 2 capsules is much better than taking 2 pills. And then there's the teach back technique. And so this is an example that I took out of the literature. I imagine you're really worried about this blood clot. I've given you a lot of information. It would be helpful to me to hear your understanding about your clot and its treatment. And I think that is a fine teach back technique. I think that's really good. I would do it a little bit differently. And I would say, I've just talked to you about this blood clot, and we've talked about it for quite a while here. And my supervisor wants to make sure I'm doing a good job. So in explaining things. So can you tell me what your understanding is, and tell me what we just talked about, so that I can show my supervisor that I can explain things. And my rationale for doing things that way is, if you do it this way, you're testing the person, right? And older adults are very sensitive to tests and cognitive tests. And some older adults even refuse to do a cognitive test because they're afraid and anxious about it. So the way this teach back is written out, it's testing the patient. The way I do it is I tell the patient really that my ability to explain things is what's really being tested here. So they're actually kind of grading the test. And it really makes it less stressful for them. At least that's what I've found. Humor is tricky. Humor is really tricky, and you really need to, it's tricky generation to generation. I mean, words are different, cultures are different. If you're from Britain, the word fag means a cigarette. In the United States, that generally means something different. So you have to be really careful with humor, unless you know somebody really well and you're sort of familiar with their culture. A lot of older adults are on the internet, and if they are, help them, just like with your younger patients, they're on the internet looking up, they're checking up on you. So make sure you're giving them reputable sites to look at, so rather than, sort of the latest Facebook craze, which may or may not be reliable. Specifically for dementia, the tone is one of the most important things. So no matter what kind of day you're having, and no matter what kind of day the person with dementia is having, you want to walk in the room with a positive communicative tone. And often that will shift the whole tone of the older adult and how they respond. So you want to do your best to have a big smile, a broad greeting, and look like you're really happy to see them. And that is going to actually increase the likelihood that they are happy to see you. And it's important to know when you're dealing with somebody with dementia, what are you looking for? Is it about the relationship or is it about getting information? And so once somebody has dementia, if it's not really about testing them and their memory over and over again, it's really, once you have the information, once you know they have dementia and you know that it's advanced, you're talking to them just to sort of see how awake they are and how interactive they are. So that's just a general conversation. It's not a, you don't need to ask them, where are you? What day is it? Because you already know that they're confused. So that's just going to frustrate them. Whereas you say, how are you? I see your the TV on. What have you been watching? Has your family been in to visit? Blah, 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 blah. So it's more about, and that way you can listen. Are they awake? Are they putting together a coherent sentence? Is that different from yesterday or last week? And for family members, that's important to do some education with. And so if your goal is to encourage conversation, and it's about the relationship, what movie would you like to watch is a much better question than what movie did you watch last night? Because somebody who's confused may have no idea what movie they watched last night. So, and that is the end of the slideshow. And so let's see if I can get the chat up. So, and Nirmala Dar loves the work of B. Levy from Yale. And I have read some of that work, although I can't give you a reference right off the top. Nirmala is also, we often equate dependence with being asexual, and that's certainly true, and they are very much unrelated. And Nirmala is pointing out that stereotyping anyone, yes, which I think it's really related to implicit bias and things that it's related to sort of assumptions that we have in the back of our head that we don't think about, because it's really hard. Nobody can think about everything all the time. So does anybody else have any questions? We have about 10 minutes. Hopefully something I said was helpful. I will just point out, I'll tell you a little story. Do you have any advice when there are safety concerns? I'm not quite, maybe you can define safety concerns. I mean, I think there certainly are there's some truisms. If you're unsure about the safety of a situation, never let anybody get between you and the door. You always want to be the person closest to the door. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure about what you mean, Patrick, about safety. One other thing I want to point out is that I think we forget how stressful it is to ask people questions. And I think the more cognitively impaired a person is, the more stressful that can be. And so when an older adult could be making choices that are potentially unsafe. Yeah, so I think that's where it comes into a matter of a capacity assessment a little bit more. I think, what I have found is older adults tend to value independence over safety. And so, people do have, if they have the capacity to make an informed consent decision, and they don't have a decision maker, what I might call wandering, they call walking. And if they're their own decision maker, they get to make that choice, even if I think it would be safer if they were put in a secure environment. But you know, we sometimes have those struggles when we have somebody who has a history of homelessness or a history of sort of being, you know, kind of a wandering type person their whole life, and they get older and they end up under our care. And some people are like, oh, well, we should put them in a memory care unit. And they're like, I can't tolerate being locked in, you know, and you've tried it and it turned out it was pretty horrible for them. You know, they acted like a caged animal because that's how they were feeling. Well, you know, so the question is, whose judgment at the end of the day is the most important? And I think it does come down to who's the legal decision maker. And I do think we need to really, safety is one thing, but I think it's like that, those differences between professionals' views and older adults' views. And I think professionals are much more concerned about safety than many, not all, but many older adults. So I think we have to tolerate that. How would you verbally de-escalate someone with dementia who is agitated? So Angela, my first question is, what do you mean by agitation? But so if one thing to do is to leave the room briefly and come back in. If somebody has Alzheimer's disease, for instance, if you leave the room out of sight, out of mind, and you come back in, somebody with very advanced dementia, and you greet them as if it's the first time you've ever seen them or the first time you've seen them in a long time. Oh, Joan, it's so great to see you. How are you doing today? You know, so you can reset the whole conversation. Sometimes Joan will go with you and other times Joan won't. I had a gentleman once, Larry, not his real name, who was very upset. He thought his car had been stolen. Well, his car hadn't been stolen. He hadn't had a car in years, but he was just getting more and more upset because people who were trying to tell him he didn't have a car, and he knew he had a car and he knew it had been stolen because he couldn't see it. And so one of the staff said, Larry, you got a stolen car here, huh? Well, let's fill out a police report. And so just started asking Larry questions, right? So instead of trying to drag Larry into our reality, they entered Larry's reality. And this is actually something that I frequently use in nursing facilities or assisted livings or hospitals, when somebody, you know, when they're paranoid or suspicious and they want to report, you know, somebody was, you know, murdered in the parking lot, which if there wasn't somebody murdered in the parking lot, of course, or that there were assaults happening in the room next door. I always say, well, that is horrible. Are you safe? And so sometimes you can just get them, you can change the subject that way. Other times they won't go off the topic. And then I say, well, you know, that is really horrible. And we want to have a safe place here. And I'm going to go talk to the charge nurse because they're in charge. And we will make a report to the proper authorities because that sounds horrible. Because really, I mean, if somebody was getting murdered in the parking lot or they were getting assaulted in the room next door, right, that's the right answer, right? We're going to report it. So I think, so yes, Tifa Snow, matching the emotional state. I see you're really angry right now. I would be really angry too. Well, I think that sort of depends, but I think that definitely can work. I'm not sure that I would get really angry right along with someone, but that's kind of when I say, oh, that's horrible. Like somebody says, you know, that people were murdered in the parking lot outside their window or in the room next door or whatever. I'm like, well, that is horrible, which is matching their emotional state. And then I will report that to the authorities so that we can get that taken care of. So I think it's perhaps not, it's not as mirroring that. I see you're really angry right now. I would be angry too, is sort of kind of verbally mirroring the emotional state that somebody else has. I'm not sure that I would do that very often, but depending on what stage of dementia a person is in, that might very well work. And I do think recognizing and addressing where someone is does help people regain control of themselves. And I think most of us feel better when we feel in control. And so when the other thing to remember when people are angry, many times when people are angry, anger is an emotion that has strength to it. Whereas being fearful or shameful are really horribly painful and weak states to be in. And so nobody likes to be afraid or to feel ashamed. And so many of us, the moment we are afraid or are ashamed, we cover that with anger. So sometimes when people are angry, what they really are is fearful. And so being a little bit of a detective and thinking about that, because if that's the real issue, then you want to address the fear. Which gets back into, some people view people in a uniform, like a police uniform, as very reassuring. And so it can be helpful to even, I've been in situations where it was helpful to just have a security guard walk through and everybody felt safer. Whereas for other populations, like that is the least safe person on the planet, would be somebody in a uniform like that. So you would not want to have a security guard walk through for somebody like that, you know. So it's knowing, again, that would be kind of cultural and background, knowing things about the person. But I do think addressing the emotion is very important. Dr. Nash, could you speak some on the topic of money matters and older adults, management of conflict with family members? Well, that is sort of a topic unto itself. And I think it's important to know who the decision maker is. And hopefully, if you are dealing with older adults before they lose capacity, you can get some, you know, a financial power of attorney. And then if you have concerns about abuse, then you need to sort of go into the abuse and neglect line of things, which is kind of the legal realm, and that gets very complicated. But,
and that's a great segue for, we could throw that topic in down the road, but we're going to have to wrap it up for today. And just know that next month's topic is personality disorders in the older adult.